Hello everyone, my name is Sean Crosby, and today I'd like to talk to you about sawmills and their social and economic impacts on early America. The invention of the sawmill and its implementation in America led to a multitude of factors that helped grow the emerging country into what we know it today. Similarly to how the early civilizations used agriculture to grow, early Americans used their abundant forests and lumber production to grow. A sawmill was a building or a machine that would use either wind or water to power a blade in an up and down motion, causing it to cut the wood. An invention called the pitman arm was used that would transfer the circular motion of the water wheel into the up and down motion necessary for the blade. The first sawmill technology dates back to the 3rd century BCE, and it was located in current-day Turkey. It was a Roman water-powered stone sawmill. And as you can see in this diagram, the water would come in and turn the water wheel, which would turn a gear system connected to 2 arms, which were connected to the pitman arm. And those pitman arms transferred the water wheel power to the 2 saws, which would move back and forth, cutting the stone. While well before the first wooden sawmill, it was the first instance of a water wheel being connected to a crank and then connected to a saw. The Dutch and Germans had wooden sawmills in the 15th century, and as the Europeans began colonizing America, it would soon become a much-needed addition to the budding country. The reason sawmills were so important in early America was because of how labor-intensive it was to produce lumber at the time. It was hard labor, and it wasn't their primary job. They made lumber as needed at first, but as population started to grow, so did the need for more lumber. 2 methods were typically used. They were either split and planed, which means the logs would be taken and they would use wedges, drive them into it, split off pieces of the boards, and then those would be planed and smoothed out until they were usable. The other way they were made was being hand sawed with a pit saw. If you look at this picture here, you can see a depiction of the 2 types of pit sawing that would go on. There was the open pit, which was just a pit in the ground that they would place the log on top of, and they would use an open pit saw. Or they would build 2 trestles and place the log on top of that and use a framed pit saw. And here you can see a picture of a framed pit saw, and this one here was almost 5 feet long. And here you can see some different open pit saws. And these were used in the United States until about the 1900s. Early sawmills connected water power to the pit saw to alleviate the use of human labor. And then over time, the invention of the circular saw blade, as well as thinner blades, made the process more efficient. Tabitha Babbitt, who's a shaker in Massachusetts, saw the other men in her village struggling with how much effort was required to hand saw logs. She also saw that there was a lot of wasted energy because with a pit saw, it only cut on the downstroke. So what she did was invented and made a prototype of the first circular saw so that as it was spinning, it was always cutting and there was no lost energy. In colonial America, there was a great need for lumber. Unlike the early civilizations, the early Americans didn't use brick and mortar to build because lumber was so abundant and relatively easy to manipulate. Houses and buildings were built from lumber and they needed a steady production of it to keep up with the expanding population. As the settlers began to come to America, the lack of labor and the need for lumber made it imperative to come up with a more efficient way to produce lumber. 2 men hand sawing could produce 50 feet of pine boards a day, whereas the early sawmills could produce somewhere around 1,000 feet of pine boards a day. The first sawmills in the colonies were built in New York and Maine. The first English sawmill was built near York, Maine, sometime in the 1620s. Maine was a prime location for sawmills because of their abundant supply of pine trees, as well as thousands of rivers to produce power. The Dutch built their first sawmill in New Amsterdam, or current-day New York, and it was built around 1620. By 1650, the sawmill was typically the first commercial building that was erected in a new settlement. And by 1700, there were 70 sawmills in New England. As lumber production began to advance and sawmills began to become more prevalent, the lumber industry became a boost to the economy. First, there was the timber famine in Europe. During the Neolithic period, when they cleared the lands of Europe to have room for agriculture, most of the trees were decimated. And it was also the primary source of fuel in England at the time. So those two factors led to a severe shortage of lumber in England. Mills would make lumber to ship to Europe along with huge trees for ship masts. In fact, many of the mills that were set up early on supplied lumber directly and solely to King George. Wood was also exported to places like the Caribbean and the West Indies, places that were starving for lumber. Another factor that led to a great need for lumber was the fishing industry, and in turn the shipbuilding industry. By the end of the colonial period, there were almost 800 fishing ships running out of the colonies, and those required a lot of lumber and a lot of shipbuilding. Growth and advancement of the American civilization was predicated on lumber production. Unlike so many other civilizations, the American settlers already knew how to farm and brought with them the techniques and methods they had been using for centuries. But with such an abundance of lumber in tree form, the sawmill created a new form of income and trade. Sawmills are also further evidence of the perseverance and ingenuity of the humans. The lack of labor forced the implementation and the improvement of the sawmill to meet the needs of the growing population. Sawmills have continued to advance and have become almost completely automated. No matter how much sawmills change, one thing stays the same. As it was in colonial times, we as humans require a lot of lumber for our expanding population, and the sawmill still proves to be a vital part of our way of life. Many people just go into Home Depot or Lowe's and grab some lumber and take it for granted, but it's really been thousands of years of ingenuity and advancement that has allowed for the convenience that we all cherish so much. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.